Alberta puts two images in people's minds: oil derricks and mountain postcards. Banff, Calgary's skyline, the Rockies at golden hour. What the tourism boards leave out is everything else. The dried-up towns on the prairie, the bunkers and bases that the government quietly decommissioned, the industrial graveyards rusting quietly on the edge of nowhere. Alberta has been built and gutted and rebuilt so many times that the wreckage of every previous version is still out there, sitting in the grass, waiting for someone to go looking. These 13 places didn't make the brochure. They should have. 13. Dorothy. Dorothy sits in the Red Deer River Badlands, and on a still day, the wind through it sounds like breathing. About 180 kilometers east of Calgary, it was a farming and ranching community that grew up in the early 1900s when the railway pushed through and settlers followed behind it, convinced the semi-arid grassland could be made productive. For a while, it was. Dorothy had a school, a post office, a church, a handful of businesses serving the surrounding homesteads. Then, the drought hit. Then the depression hit on top of the drought. Then the young people who might have stayed left for the cities and never returned. The population today is somewhere in the single digits, a few people rattling around in a community built for hundreds. What makes Dorothy remarkable is not just the emptiness, but the physical beauty of its surroundings. The Badlands rise around it in striated columns of red and gray. The river valley cuts deep below the prairie, and the abandoned buildings photograph in a way that makes the place look like it belongs in a film set rather than a real province. It is entirely real and almost entirely forgotten. 12. Nordegg. Nordegg spent decades as a ghost town before anyone decided to do anything about it. And the thing they eventually decided to do was preserve it, which means Nordegg now occupies a strange middle ground between ruin and restoration. The coal mining community was established in 1912 by German-Canadian businessman Martin Nordegg in the foothills west of Rocky Mountain House. And at its height in the 1940s, it housed 2,500 people in a company-planned town site with paved streets, a hospital, a skating rink, and brick buildings that would have looked at home in any mid-sized Alberta city. The mine closed in 1955 when natural gas replaced coal as Alberta's dominant heating fuel almost overnight, and the town emptied with a speed that left much of the infrastructure intact. Decades of slow deterioration followed before heritage designation brought restoration funding. Today, the mining complex, one of the most complete surviving examples of a Canadian coal operation, is a National Historic Site, and tours run through the Lamp House and the mine buildings through the summer months. The residential streets behind the mine are a different story. Quiet, largely empty. The houses of a workforce that dissolved 70 years ago. 11. Beaver Mines. 20 kilometers from Waterton Lakes National Park, and most Waterton visitors drive straight past it without a second glance. Beaver Mines was a coal mining settlement active from around 1904, positioned to supply fuel to the railway lines pushing south through Alberta toward the American border. The community had its own school, its own small commercial district, its own identity separate from the larger mine towns nearby. When the coal market shifted and the seam quality failed to justify continued extraction, the operation wound down and the population dispersed. What makes Beaver Mines worth seeking out today is the physical landscape around the former town site. The Rockies are close enough to fill the western horizon completely, Castle Mountain looming over the valley in a way that makes the human ruins below it feel very small and very temporary. A few residents still live in the area. The cemetery holds the people who came for the coal and stayed forever. 10. Labish Mission. The mission at Labish was established by Oblate missionaries in 1853, making it one of the oldest European-built structures in Alberta still standing in anything approaching its original form. The complex included a church, a residence, a farm, a school, and later, a convent. An entire institutional settlement dropped into the boreal forest north of Edmonton at a time when most of Alberta was unmapped by European cartographers. The mission served as a supply depot for Oblate operations across the northwest, and goods shipped through it reached communities as far north as the Arctic coast. What happened to the Labish Mission was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual retreat as roads and then aircraft made the waterway supply routes obsolete. The mission's logistical importance evaporated, and its population contracted. The buildings that remain, including a church that was reconstructed following a fire, sit on a peninsula jutting into the lake, a cluster of whitewashed structures in a landscape that feels unchanged from the era in which they were built. It is a provincial historic site, visited by few, known by fewer. 9. Kitsum Reservoir Ghost Farms. When the St. Mary River Irrigation District expanded its reservoir system in southern Alberta through the mid-20th century, it drowned farmsteads. Families who had worked the same land for 2 and 3 generations were bought out, relocated, and their properties flooded. In dry years, and Alberta's south has been getting drier, the water level drops far enough that what went under comes back up. Fence posts emerge from the lakebed. Foundation walls reappear at the water's edge. Remnants of corrals and root cellars surface for a season, then go back under when the water rises. The landscape shifts between presence and absence depending entirely on rainfall, creating a situation where the same piece of ground might be a reservoir bottom in a wet year and a haunted farmyard in a drought. Nobody marked these sites. Nobody put interpretive signs beside them. They surface when the water allows it. And for the farmers whose grandparents lost the land, the reappearance is not a tourist attraction. 8. Ribbon Creek. Ribbon Creek sits in the Kananaskis Valley southwest of Calgary, and most people who ski or hike in Kananaskis have no idea it's there. A coal mining operation active from 1907, the Ribbon Creek mine produced good quality coking coal for the steel industry and supported a small but functional community in the mountain bunkhouses, a manager's residence, the infrastructure of an isolated industrial operation in difficult terrain. The mine closed in 1952, and the buildings were left to the mountain climate. What makes Ribbon Creek strange today is its proximity to some of the most heavily used recreational land in Alberta. The site is a short hike from trails that see tens of thousands of visitors each year, and the ruins of the mine operation sit quietly in the forest while people walk past them on their way to something more immediately scenic. The mountain setting is extraordinary creek, spruce forest, limestone peaks overhead, and the mine remains have been there long enough that the forest has begun absorbing them, which gives the site a quality that purpose-built heritage attractions almost never achieve. 7. Rowley. Rowley is not entirely abandoned, which is what makes it peculiar. A handful of permanent residents still live in the community on the prairie east of Drumheller, but the majority of what Rowley contains, the grain elevator, the old hotel, the false-fronted shops along the main street, exists in a state of deliberate preservation, funded partly by the residents themselves and partly by film and television productions that periodically descend on the town site because it photographs so convincingly as a 1930s prairie settlement. Rowley peaked sometime in the 1920s, when the surrounding farmland was productive enough to sustain a real community, and has been contracting ever since. What's strange is the self-awareness of it. Rowley knows it is a ghost town, has leaned into that identity, and has built its continued existence partly on the fact of its own decline. The hotel bar still operates on weekends. The grain elevator is one of the last wooden ones left in Alberta. The people who remain are keeping something alive that by conventional logic should not still exist. 6. East Kulie. The Atlas coal mine at East Kulie is the last wooden coal tipple standing in Canada. That sentence does not quite convey what it means to stand beside it, a vast timber structure rising from the Red Deer River Valley floor, its angled chutes and conveyor frames intact after 70 years of wind and prairie winter. East Kulie had over 3,000 residents at its 1940s peak, supported entirely by the coal seams running through the badlands beneath it. Natural gas pushed coal out of the Alberta market by the mid-1950s, and the town contracted by 2/3 within a decade. The mine is now a National Historic Site with summer tours, the tipple preserved as the central artifact of a way of life the province abandoned in a single generation. The drive in through the Badlands, following the river valley as it cuts through millions of years of sediment, is itself one of the more dramatic approaches to any heritage site in Alberta. 5. Estuary Coolie Homesteads, the dryland farming experiment. The Canadian government ran across the southern prairies in the early 20th century was one of the most consequential failures in the country's agricultural history. Settlers were handed quarter sections under the Dominion Lands Act and told the rain would follow the plow, a theory promoted by railway companies with obvious financial reasons for wanting the prairie settled. In the Kulie country of southeastern Alberta, those settlers built from whatever was available: sod, rough lumber, salvaged timber. Sod walls are 2 feet thick. Root cellars dug into coulee banks. Dugout shelters were meant as temporary quarters that became permanent homes for families who ran out of money before they could build anything better. The dirty 30s finished what the dry years had started. The houses they left behind are still out there, mostly on private land, slowly compressing back into the ground they were made from. 4. Wayne. Getting to Wayne requires crossing 11 suspension bridges on the same road, which is reason enough to go. A former coal mining settlement in the Rosebud River Valley east of Drumheller, it feels genuinely remote despite being less than 2 hours from Calgary. Wayne had around 2,500 residents at its peak in the 1920s and 30s, when the Midland Coal Company was pulling significant tonnage from the seams beneath the valley. Closures came through the 1950s, the population fell to double digits, and Wayne stayed there somewhere between 15 and 30 people depending on the year. What sets it apart is the Rose Deer Hotel, open continuously since 1913, serving as a community anchor for a ghost town that technically still has residents. Its walls are lined with photographs of Wayne in its industrial prime. Outside, the Badlands sit in complete silence. 3. Lundbreck and the Krausness Pass ruins. The Krausness Pass is so layered with industrial history that individual entries barely do it justice. Frank, Bellevue, Hillcrest, Coleman, Blairmore, and Lundbreck sit within kilometers of each other, each carrying its own weight of disaster and decline. Frank is the most famous. The mountain above it collapsed in 1903, burying 70 people under 90 million tons of limestone in 90 seconds, and the rock field still covers the valley floor. Hillcrest holds Canada's worst mining disaster, 189 men killed in a single explosion in 1914. Bellevue has the only underground mine tour in Alberta, and Lundbreck, at the eastern edge of the pass, is the quietest of farming community, rather than a mining one, sitting where the mountains end and the prairie begins. Its grain elevator and original buildings existing in a landscape that feels like the edge of two different worlds. 2. Dunore Junction. Dunmore is where the railway made its decision and a town paid for it. The Canadian Pacific Main Line split at Dunmore Junction east of Medicine Hat. One branch pushed west, one south, toward Lethbridge. Through the 1880s and 1890s, Dunmore was a significant node of hotels, saloons, supply operations, the full complement of junction commerce. When the CPR rationalized its routes and the traffic shifted, businesses followed the customers toward Medicine Hat, 7 kilometers away. The town didn't collapse. It was draining. What's strange about Dunmore today is the near-complete absence of evidence for what it once was. No dramatic ruins, just a name on a road sign and a handful of older residents who remember when it was something more. 1. Alderson. Alderson is the clearest picture of what happened when the agricultural dream met the reality of the land. Founded in 1914 in the special areas east of Brooks Shortgrass Prairie that looks fertile in wet years, and like another planet in dry ones, it reached around 500 people by the early 1920s, with a bank, a newspaper, hotels, churches, and a land office selling quarter sections to optimistic families. Then the rain stopped. Then 1929. Then the full weight of the 1930s drought, and Alderson began losing people the way a punctured tire loses air steadily, then faster, then nearly all at once. Today, the site holds a few standing structures, a grain elevator among the last of its type in the province, and a pioneer cemetery facing the empty grassland. No interpretive signs, no heritage designation. The wind moves through without stopping. The grass has grown back over most of what was built, and you would never know, driving past, that 500 people once had their entire lives here. Alberta's history moves fast and forgets faster. The oil booms, the busts, the farming experiments that ran out of rain, the railway junctions that lost their traffic every generation have left something behind, and most of it is still out there. If you know a place in Alberta that belongs on a list like this, something strange, something the highway signs don't mention, put it in the comments. And if this kind of history is what you came for, subscribe. There is more of it in more provinces, and it is not going to tell itself.